Hi, my name is Atif Kamal, and this is the first episode of my podcast, Be Logical. Before I get into the first episode, I want to give you some background on who I am, the structure of this podcast, and why I'm making this podcast. Okay? Now, I graduated from UC Berkeley in fall of 2009 with my bachelor's in philosophy. Currently, I'm working on a teacher credential program. I'm expecting to have my credential this November. And I'm writing a book on logic and reasoning, and I'm also offering free online workshops on logic and reasoning. You can find out more about that by going to the website logicandreasoning.webs.com. Okay. Now the structure of this podcast will be that first I will present to you, I'll describe to you one or more specific concepts of logic, and then I will give you a situation, which could be from the news, it could be from politics, from entertainment, and so on. And then after I describe that situation to you, I will show you how the specific concept described apply to that situation. I'll do that either by showing you how those concepts help you solve a problem in that situation, or how you can use those concepts to analyze that situation. Okay. Now, to explain why I'm doing this podcast, I want to tell you first my fundamental reason for doing this podcast, and then more specifically to this podcast, why I'm doing it. Okay, now my fundamental reason for doing this podcast is it's my conviction that it would be ideal if as many people as possible were as logical and reasonable as possible, so far as logic and reasoning applies to a situation. And I basically think, like, if you had two identical people with one identical situation to make, the one who bases their decisions on logic and reasoning effectively and appropriately, as in they apply it to situations which are appropriate, such as situations that aren't based solely on preference, versus a person who doesn't use concepts of logic and reasoning at all. The person who bases their decisions on logic and reason will make the more effective decision, almost always, I would say. I want to say always, but it's hard to know for sure. Okay, now specifically why I am doing this podcast is because, well, first I think if you ask any given person whether logic is valuable, I think almost every single one of them will tell you, yes, logic is valuable. That's my guess. Also, I'm guessing that if you ask those same people about some specific concepts of logic, what are some specific concepts of logic, very few of them will be able to tell you any. My hope is that by presenting you with situations that interest you and showing you how specific concepts of logic apply to those situations, you or the rest of my audience will be that much more interested in personally learning about specific concepts of logic and practicing using those concepts. Yeah, so that's basically why I'm doing this podcast. Now, I'm going to get into the first episode. Now, here are one concept is a concept of logic. The other concept is instrumental to making good logical arguments, but it's not necessary to make an argument which is logical. Now, the first concept is a contradiction. A contradiction consists of two propositions. A proposition consists of a subject and a predicate, and a proposition reflects an attempt to state something that's true. Now, here's an example. In the sentence, Atif is making a podcast, Atif would be the subject, and making a podcast would be the predicate. Now, between the two propositions in a contradiction, they both have the exact same subject and the exact same predicate, or the subject and predicate are equivalent to each other, although they're worded differently. For now, we'll just say, to make it simple, they have to have the exact same subject and predicate. Now, the only difference is that in one proposition, the predicate is negated of the subject. So in one proposition, you'll have Atif is making a podcast. In the other, you'll have Atif is not making a podcast. Now, it could be true that at one time, I am making a podcast, but at another time, I am not making a podcast. However, those statements cannot be both true or false at the same time. So for example, right now, you can't say that I am making a podcast and I am not making a podcast, okay? And that's an example of how a contradiction works. Now I'll give you an idea of what I mean by the concept of being vague. Okay, now when a word is used vaguely, that means that word is general, okay, and it can be broken down into smaller categories. So let's say that you tell me that you bought a car, okay, and then these are the kinds of questions I'd ask you to make that concept more precise, to make it less vague. I'd ask you, oh, like, what kind of car is it? Or since that question itself is vague, I could ask you, what is the manufacturer of the car? Then you tell me, oh, well, it's a Honda. Then I'll ask you again, what kind of Honda is it? And you tell me, like, oh, it's a Honda Civic. We're making it more precise there. Then I ask you, oh, well, what kind of Honda Civic is it? What year is it? Oh, it's a 2011 Honda Civic. Then I'll ask you again, what kind of Honda Civic 2011 is it? And a question you could give me is, well, it's a red Honda Civic 2011. Okay, and each time I ask you that question, each time you would answer me in that way, you're making the idea of a car more specific. Okay, now I'll move on to a commercial that I want to show you. I saw this commercial a couple of weeks ago during the Super Bowl. I personally, I don't really watch the Super Bowl that much, or at all actually, but my friends were really into it, and this commercial had just caught my eye. It's an iPhone 5 commercial, and basically in this commercial they claim that their phone like defies laws of physics. I'm no physicist, so I couldn't personally be annoyed by that part, but the part that I was annoyed by was that by stating that their phone defies laws of physics, they were also implying that their phone can defy ideas of logic. Okay. Now, you can watch the commercial, then I'll tell you what I mean.
There are laws to physics, right? So explain this. How can something get bigger and smaller? There's more of it and less of it? Well, I guess the laws of physics are more like general guidelines.
So in that ad, they show you the phone with the screen facing you. They're holding it horizontally, and they say it's bigger. But then they hold it vertically, and they turn it towards you and say, then, but it's smaller. Now here's the thing. It can't be both bigger and smaller compared to, say, the last iPhone. That just isn't possible. So the idea that you should get when they're showing you the screen of the phone is, oh, when they say that it's bigger, they mean that the screen is bigger than, say, like the last iPhone. And then when they turn it vertically, they mean, oh, so the phone got thinner. But they're being vague. They're not telling you how it got bigger, how it got smaller. So the language is kind of deceptive. And then again, they show this guy scrolling through the albums, and they say there's more of it. Then they're holding the phone vertically, and they turn it to the side, but there's less of it, and they show you again how thin it is. Now when they say that there's more of it, but there's less of it, there can't be both more and less of it compared to the last iPhone. And in the same way, like for example, it can't have more memory and less memory than the last iPhone. So when you see this person scrolling through the albums, the idea that you should get is, oh, when they say that there's more of it, they mean that like it holds more stuff. And then when they turn the phone vertically in their hand and they say that there's less of it, what they really mean is that it's thinner. The body is thinner. But because they're vague, um, some people might just think like, oh, that sounds really interesting, just because of that play on language. But actually, it's very, I think it's my view that that's a deceptive way of presenting it, because it sounds as if the phone can exist in contradictory ways when actually no thing can do that. Now it's another question about whether this ad is effective, or whether this ad would be more effective or persuasive if it was just simply logical and straightforward. And to that question I would say whether it's more persuasive if it's strictly just logical and straightforward, I think depends on who the ad is presented to. Not everyone is persuaded by the same thing, so maybe for one person having that play on language would be more persuasive, and for another person maybe having an ad that's more like logical and straightforward would be more persuasive. And the third option is you have both. But yeah, my view is that just the ad is kind of deceptive, since it states that in a vague way that it can exist, the iPhone 5 can exist in contradictory ways. Okay, and that is this episode of Be Logical. Alright, thank you. And also, one more thing, if you have any suggestions for what I can do in my future episodes, please let me know, because I'm always looking to improve. Okay, thank you for your time. Bye.